4 trains in just over a year, robbed at gunpoint by the notorious Doolin Gang. Now the Doolin Brothers and their cohorts planned something more audacious. The 5 bandits rode into the town of Coffeyville, hitched their horses, drew their rifles, and cut across the street, where C.M. Condon Bank stood across from the First National Bank. They were going to hit both at once. But the gang had been recognized on their way into town. While they stuck up the bankers to open the safes, townsfolk outside emerged with a barrage of gunfire. The thieves were pinned down. 2 of the gang fled from the First National with a sack of $20,000 in paper money and gold. Then the others ducked out from Condon. The bandits shot several townsfolk, but in their flight into the alley, all 5 fell in a rain of gunfire. Sole survivor Emmett Dalton, raked by bullets, was dragged into the hands of the law. And so the story went, that was the end of the Doolin Gang. But they hadn't tormented this corner of the West with a mere 5 people. A remaining Doolin brother, Bill, and a number of associates, bootleggers, bandits, and killers, remained at large. Men could seem to vanish in the Old West, and when an outlaw's trail grew cold, lawmen in their desperation might turn to those unbound by duty or procedure. Gunslingers who went along for the reward. Bounty hunters. For reasons we don't fully know, I am, like many of you, drawn to the wild and embattled parts of history, like they're compelling worlds I can visit. I think that's why I'm having so much fun with Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. It's the grimdark future of the Warhammer 40,000 universe with really satisfying tactical and fast-paced gameplay. Free-to-play and mobile, the game has over 70 legendary Warhammer champions from 17 playable factions. Tacticus has a massive and passionate online player base, so anytime and anywhere I can open the game and jump into fast-paced PvE campaigns, competitive PvP battles, and collaborative boss fights under my guild banner. They're always adding new features, game modes, and events. This month, December, they're going festive and adding the famous Red Gobbo in time for Grotmas. Again, Tacticus is free to play in pure challenging and tactical fun. Just use the QR code on screen right now or the link in the description and start conquering the battlefields of the far future. Frank Canton lived on gang turf. As both undersheriff of Pawnee County, Oklahoma Territory, and a deputy U.S. Marshal, he followed closely the depredations of the Doolin Gang. Canton was no upstanding lawman himself. There were whispers of his fondness for the bottle and penchant for brutality. He had in recent years found employ further west as a cowboy and a sheriff. His earlier story was unknown. For now, Canton had a badge and a job to do. As best as he could tell after the massacre at Coffeyville, the Doolin Gang had regrouped under the leadership of members Bill Doolin and the remaining free Doolin brother. In '93, the gang shot dead 3 deputy U.S. Marshals who tried to ambush them. They later struck a bank in Pawnee and briefly kidnapped the cashier. Amidst the rampage, commissioners made unheeded calls for the governor to institute martial law. Finally, officers gunned down the last outlaw Doolin brother in June of '94, and it was proclaimed, "The country can now draw a sigh of relief, for the terror of the West is no more. The rest of the gang will be caught." Canton withheld celebration. Under Bill Doolin, the Doolin Gang, or the Wild Bunch, featured dangerous desperados, including cockeyed Charlie Pierce, George Bitter Creek Newcomb, and Charles Dynamite Dick Clifton. Each crime swelled the price on their heads, and Canton wrote, "At that time there was from $1,000 to $3,000 offered for the body of each of the Wild Bunch, dead or alive." There were, of course, always smaller crimes to chase down. Canton went after a few men involved in stealing cattle and selling the meat in a butchery. One of them was Bill, or B. Dunn, leader of the Dunn Brothers, whom Canton regarded as bloodthirsty thieves and pals of the Wild Bunch. Here was a chance to put a nemesis behind bars, but B proposed a deal. The Dunn Brothers would help Canton take down the Wild Bunch. In return, the law would drop the cattle rustling case, and after covering mission expenses, the rewards for the outlaws would be paid to the Dunn Brothers. The Dunns would become bounty hunters. Canton accepted the proposition. Reward money was most often collected by lawmen. In nearby Indian Territory, Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves, born into slavery, now collected thousands of dollars chasing down murderers, bootleggers, and other outlaws. But private citizens could also collect. These irregular pursuers of fugitives were only much later termed bounty hunters. Not drifters picking up wanted posters as a profession, bounty hunters were instead often private detectives or, like the Dunn Brothers, folk familiar with the wanted, compelled to turn on them for cash. The Dunn Brothers and Frank Canton held each other in mutual disdain, but Canton needed access to the Wild Bunch. He knew that outlaws could turn into phantoms on the frontier. They could travel under aliases, flee to obscure haunts, or lie low in backwater ghost towns. The U.S. had pushed across the continent in waves and spurts. The government claimed land by purchase, annexation, and removal, and people flocked far west. But by the mid-19th century, distinct and decentralized indigenous nations still reigned over the large middle expanse of the country. As settlers trespassed onto treaty territory for land and minerals, clashes with strained indigenous groups, in addition to ecological devastation, emboldened U.S. officials to push conciliatory chiefs and members to sign away land on behalf of entire indigenous nations, and to make war on those who would not abandon their homelands. Disease, malnutrition, and conflict cratered the indigenous population of the United States, from perhaps several million pre-contact to only 250,000 by the late 19th century, compared to some 75 million non-indigenous people. Whether stalwart bands of Comanche and Lakota, or loyal allies to the U.S. such as the Nez Perce and Osage, inhabitants were forced onto small and often dilapidated reservations. The long arc of displacement produced by the 1890s a loose fringe of U.S. settlement known as Oklahoma Territory, patrolled by lawmen like Frank Canton, but infested with outlaws. Though the region had been designated for removed peoples, the Dawes Act of 1887 revoked the rights of indigenous nations to even their own reservations, allotting land between individual native households and opening the rest for settlement. In land rushes, settlers scrambled onto these lands. They staked claims and quarreled over paper titles. As all along the frontier, tents and wagons became creaking towns, stores, and saloons. Owning and cultivating a frontier homestead had been a dream achieved not only by male citizens, but also immigrants, women, and formerly enslaved people. But law enforcement often proved impotent. In addition to the ruffians and bandit gangs who populated the frontier, the American West hosted one of the most well-armed populations in the world. A culture that remedied insult with violence and scorned cowardice often expressed itself in impromptu and drunken shootouts. Yet things were changing. Busy towns were hung with wire. The shine of steel, wail of the railroad, and black spit of oil heralded new fortunes. An age of magnates, of Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Edison. More and more, the West was crossed by trains. Businessmen brought manufacturing, and monopolistic cattle companies edged out local cowboys. Settlers' hopes of a self-sufficient life on a sprawling homestead withered. And so the desperados who held up banks, tormented the railroads, and rustled cattle from the intruding corporate hegemons became popular figures of resistance. Bill Doolin courted public opinion well. He gave grocery money to poor settlers and made friends with townsfolk, who in turn tipped him off when the law was closing in. But the Wild Bunch did not ride in the name of charity. In early 1895, the gang crossed onto reservation land to steal horses from the Creek or Muskogee Nation. Indigenous residents chased the gang in a rolling firefight, and the bandits scattered. Alerted by the Dunn boys, Frank Canton rode to the scene. The bandits were long gone, hiding somewhere. Ever suspicious, Canton informed the Dunn boys that he and the sheriff would, for the time being, camp in the woods behind the Dunn place. He expected at least some of the Wild Bunch to show. Bitter Creek Newcomb had stashed money with the Dunn boys, and it was rumored that he was intimately involved with the Dunn's teenage sister, Rose. A week passed without any sign of the Wild Bunch, but the Dunns told Canton that 80 miles west, the gang had stuck up a train. The thieves made off, except for Tulsa Jack, who was tracked and shot by deputy U.S. Marshals. The most feared deputy U.S. Marshals active in these parts would become legends of the Wild West, known as the Three Guardsmen: Heck Thomas, Bill Tilghman, and Chris Madsen. They were wolves who tracked day and night, capturing or gunning down hundreds of infamous outlaws. Frank Canton resented the success of the Three Guardsmen. With little to show for his alliance with the Dunn boys, he abandoned his stakeout camp in late April. About a week later, Wild Bunch gang members Bitter Creek Newcomb and cockeyed Charlie Pierce arrived at the Dunn place. What can be gleaned from the muddled accounts of that night is that the outlaws never saw the sun rise. The Dunn brothers shot their friends, loaded their corpses onto a wagon, covered them in a tarp, and made for the capital of Guthrie to present their cargo to Marshal Nix. Nix had earlier approved the Dunn's ambush plan, and sent guardsmen Heck Thomas and Bill Tilghman to monitor from afar. The papers would run a story about how a deputy named Sam Schaefer and his posse slew the outlaws, but Schaefer was merely an alias used by one of the Dunn brothers to cover their identities. With Pierce and Newcomb dead, the Wild Bunch had no idea the Dunns had betrayed them. Canton arrived in Guthrie, feeling cheated out of his chance to capture the outlaws, and he noticed something strange about the bodies. The Dunns had claimed they waited for the outlaws to arrive and shot them when they resisted arrest, but Canton noticed the wounds were consistent with victims who were lying down, perhaps executed in their sleep. While dead or alive bounties promised reward even if the wanted was brought in dead, they were not a license to kill. Shooting an unarmed or non-threatening fugitive could still constitute murder. In practice, however, authorities often welcomed the demise of criminals and accepted dubious justifications for the use of lethal force. The Dunn brothers' conflicting accounts went unquestioned. Judges and lawmen did not pretend to be the only participants in the business of justice. Those who professed to uphold the law often did so without a badge. The private Pinkerton Detective Agency infiltrated gangs and had procured large contracts from the government. And bounties on the heads of outlaws were often lucrative insofar as the pot had been sweetened by large companies that wanted to bring down the men who threatened their shipping and supplies. Back in '81, the famed lawman Wyatt Earp sent a telegram inquiring if the reward for a group of bandits would stand if they were brought in dead. He received confirmation it would. Earp hadn't contacted his official superior, but rather the issuers of the bounty, the express and banking company Wells Fargo. Only a few years back, Frank Canton himself had been a hired gun for a monopolistic cattle association in Wyoming, which conducted extra-legal assassinations and executions of local competitors and homesteaders whom they accused of cattle rustling. Canton was suspected of involvement in at least one murder during this so-called Johnson County War, but corrupt officials thwarted attempts to prosecute the cattle barons and their vigilantes. Canton had made a fine mercenary. One cowboy recalled, "Frank was the fastest gunman I ever knew." Life with a badge hadn't been glamorous. If rewards for wanted men served as incentive for lawmen and bounty-hunting civilians, they also introduced rivalry among them. The Dunn brothers pocketed the reward money for Pierce and Newcomb without even reimbursing Canton for his personal expenses. Canton retaliated by arresting B. Dunn for aiding outlaws. The charges were dismissed, for the Dunns had gained powerful friends. They had joined the posse of guardsmen Thomas and Tilghman, pursuing the bounties on the rest of the Wild Bunch. Canton contented himself with saloon drinking by night and deputy marshal work by day. That summer he arrested 2 young girls rumored by some to have run with the Wild Bunch. The gun-toting 15 and 16-year-olds Cattle Annie and Jenny Little Britches Stevens. Both were sent to Massachusetts, the younger to reform school, the elder to prison. Tilghman arrested Little Bill Raidler in September, and single-handedly arrested Bill Doolin in early 1896. Officers shot Red Buck Waitman in March, and a few months later, Texas Marshals nabbed Dynamite Dick Clifton and threw him in jail with Doolin. Yet within 2 weeks, Clifton and Doolin broke out. The feared gang leader roamed free again. B. Dunn and his brothers had a lead on where Doolin might show, a house where Doolin's wife was staying. On the night of August 26, the guardsman Heck Thomas, 4 Dunn brothers, and a few other posse members lay in wait as Bill Doolin led a horse out of the stable. They shouted to him, warning him that he was surrounded. Doolin allegedly fired first, and Heck Thomas killed him with a shotgun. The Dunn brothers received shares of the $1,400 bounty, and at last it seemed that Bill Doolin's notorious wild bunch had met its end. Theirs was a fate that befell so many outlaws, cut down by bullets or arrested to languish in a cell or face execution. Frank Canton knew the story of a man from Texas who years back led a gang. Joe Horner, he was called. Besides his career in banditry, Horner once shot 2 black U.S. soldiers after an insult. Authorities finally threw him in a Texas prison. Then, while on a work gang in 1879, Joe Horner escaped. And that was the last anyone heard of him. There were some outlaws, it seemed, who got away. Most of all, Frank Canton wanted the Dunn brothers behind bars. He regarded them as criminals who had furthermore betrayed their arrangement and deprived him of bounty money by leading other lawmen to the Wild Bunch. In the fall of 1896, Canton revived the original cattle rustling charges and had a warrant issued for B. Dunn, while the butcher who had received the stolen cattle was imprisoned. Still working with the Guardsmen, Dunn received a commission as a special deputy U.S. Marshal. Now backed by a badge, the gun-toting B. Dunn rode into Pawnee looking for Frank Canton. A saloon keeper ducked inside, sensing trouble. Around 2 in the afternoon, Frank Canton exited a restaurant and strolled up the plank sidewalk. Folk gathered on the dusty street. B. Dunn stepped out from a stairway, now face to face with Canton. Dunn's hand rested on his revolver. He told Canton that he had it in for him, that they had a score to settle. That was the end of B. Dunn. One through the eyebrow. Canton maintained that he fired in self-defense and he was exonerated. The legend of the showdown grew with time. Some claimed B. Dunn had drawn his gun, but his hand caught on his suspenders. Canton claimed decades later that Dunn had worn a steel breastplate underneath, which would have ricocheted back any shot to his torso. Embellishment had always been a part of the Old West. Myths and dramatic retellings were published and portrayed as the events unfolded. Wild West shows toured the country, showcasing famed gunslingers and Native Americans in reenactments. Historical figures and events became characters and tropes. The reign of the outlaw gangs was fading. Deputy marshals soon took out Dynamite Dick Clifton. Frank Canton was not long for Oklahoma Territory. Folk were moving north. The Klondike Gold Rush. Canton worked to obtain a deputy marshal commission in Alaska, and there he scoured the Yukon River region for gold, and spent his nights in frozen boomtowns. The line between law and anarchy had blurred out west, like kicked-up trail dust. Years ago, the infamous Dalton brothers had been deputy marshals like himself. Canton's great secret was that he had followed the same path in the opposite direction. His date of birth and place of origin were lies, as was his name. Frank Canton never existed, because Frank Canton was merely the alias of escaped outlaw Joe Horner. Years after his escape, he covertly procured a pardon from the Texas governor. And so he remained a lawman tasked with bringing killers and thieves to justice, himself a killer and a thief who evaded justice. This is my brother Joe at work at like 10 times the speed. Each of the dozens of art pieces you just saw was several hours of work, informed by my historical research. Joe and I are the entire History Dose team, and the 2 best ways to support us are 1, simply checking out our sponsor, or 2, joining the Patreon for as little as $1. Patreon perks include access to our Discord, bonus videos released after every episode, the ability to vote on new topics, and much more. Links are in the description. Thanks.